Chapter 46, in which Parker Haddaway performs a good deed. Even by quaint French village standards, the seaside village we found ourselves in was ridiculously quaint and French, except for one strange detail. I was quite certain I'd just seen an American flag flying on someone's front porch. We drove through town until a few hundred yards before the sea, a roundabout split the road, making way for a long strip of grass that ran toward an imposing monument perched above the beach. More flags flew on either side of the monument: American, Canadian, British, and others. "Where are we?" I asked, parking the van alongside the road. "Omaha Beach," Garland said, and he opened his door and stepped out of the van. Parker and I followed him, but kept our distance as he stood in front of the massive concrete monument. The script at the top was in French, and below the English translation read, "The Allied forces landing on this shore, which they call Omaha Beach, liberate Europe. June 6th, 1944. Behind, on the beach, the high tide had almost reached another monument, this one a sculpture resembling enormous shards of metal stuck in the sand. Parker whispered for me to wait where I was, and she walked over to Garland and grabbed his hand. She said something to him I didn't catch, and he put his arm around her, and the two of them stood there for another minute or two before turning around and walking past me to the van. "One more stop," Parker said, when I climbed in the van, which we'd left running because we didn't have the key. This time, Parker gave perfect turn-by-turn directions, and minutes later, we arrived at the very locked gates of the Normandy American Cemetery. I parked the van next to a no parking sign and said, "It's closed." "To the public," Parker replied. "Yeah, that's us. We're the public." "Speak for yourself, Edwin Green." And she and Garland got out of the van and had already crawled under the gate by the time I set the parking brake and followed them. We walked through an empty parking lot and across a brick road before passing through some trees into the cemetery. The graves, marked with simple white crosses or the occasional Star of David, stretched out in perfect lines as far as I could see. We followed behind Garland as he walked through the cemetery, and stopped when he knelt to examine one of the crosses. "Did you know him?" I asked, after he got to his feet. "I never met this man," he said, "but in a way I suppose we all knew each other." He pointed to the date on the marker and said, "He died on D-Day. A lot of them did." Then I realized where I'd seen the cemetery before, and I asked Garland, "Have you ever seen Saving Private Ryan?" Garland looked at me and said, "Son, would you want to watch a movie about all your friends dying, starring Forrest Gump?" "I guess not," I said. "Well, me either," he replied with a wink, and continued his walk through the field of crosses. We followed him until he stopped under a gnarled oak tree, and the three of us looked out on the cemetery. The sun was setting behind us, and beyond the cliffs, a man with a dog was walking along Omaha Beach. I began reading the dates on the surrounding crosses, and a lump rose in my throat when I realized many of the soldiers buried there were only a year or two older than me. "I've always felt so much guilt about the war," Garland said, looking straight ahead. "All these men, my brothers, here on this hellish beach getting blown to bits, and where was I? Holed up in bed with a beautiful French girl." I began to protest, but Parker put her hand on my shoulder and I stopped. Garland kept talking. "The night before the invasion, we were lying in my bed listening to the BBC, and the man read a poem with a line about monotonous languor. Maddie jumped off the bed and turned the radio up louder than she'd ever dared before. She kept repeating phrases that made no sense to me. 'John has a long mustache. The Cotentin is a peninsula. The sirens have bleached hair. The dice are thrown. Tonight, Maddie said when the broadcast was over. The Allies land tonight. Soon we could hear the big guns down on the coast. Huge, earth-shaking roars that rattled the windows to our room, even though the beaches were 25 miles away. There was lots of noise in the streets, too. Not just Germans, but French people, too, ignoring the curfew. Planes would buzz the town, and if the German anti-aircraft guns lit up the sky with orange tracers, we knew it was the Allies. We sat up all night and dreamed about our lives after the Germans were gone and the war was over. Where we'd live, what we'd do. I wanted to stay in Saint-Lô. She wanted to come back with me to the States. A bird landed on one of the crosses in front of us, and we watched it until it flew away. The next morning, it felt like the whole town was out in the streets, Garland said, and like a couple of idiots, we joined them. Wait, I said. You went outside? Where all the Germans were? Maddie gave me some of her father's clothes and his old hat, Garland said. It was stupid, but we were young and in love, and, no offense, teenagers do stupid things sometimes. Like breaking old geezers out of their nursing homes and taking them to France, Parker said. Exactly, Garland said, and smiled. Anyway, people were everywhere, not celebrating, but smiling and exchanging knowing looks. So it is true, Maddie asked a woman she knew. Yes, the Allies landed last night, the woman whispered. They will be here by nightfall. Maddie squeezed my hand with excitement just as a truck full of Nazi soldiers drove past and ordered everyone to stay indoors until further notice. I fought the urge to give them the finger and stared down at my borrowed shoes instead. That's incredible, I said. But I should have been flying that day, son, Garland said. I should have been doing my part. If I had been, some of these boys might still be alive, not in this damn cemetery. Dear Miss Haddaway, Parker said, and Garland and I both turned toward her. She held a handwritten letter and continued to read. I cannot begin to thank you enough for taking the time to write. My father didn't talk about the war much, and us kids knew not to pry, but we all knew the name Garland Lennox. The story of Mr. Lennox's heroic actions during the early hours of April 24th, 1944, was the only war story my father ever told, and he told it because he believed, if not for Mr. Lennox, he would have died that night. But he also told us the story of Garland Lennox to help us understand how the actions of one person can ripple through generations. I won't bore you with the details of mine or my siblings' life stories, but I speak for us all when I say, because of Garland Lennox, we've lived our lives mindful of the exponential effect our good and brave deeds have on others. After the war, my father returned to Kansas, married my mother, and ran a sporting goods store in Salina for 45 years. He had 6 children, 22 grandchildren, and I've enclosed a photograph of us all at Papa's 84th birthday party in 2010. He died 6 months later. Miss Haddaway, thank you again for reaching out, and promise me you will give Mr. Lennox the biggest hug from me. Sincerely, Martha Alsobrook Moore, oldest daughter of Captain Pete Alsobrook, United States Army Air Force, 1941 to 1946. Parker handed Garland the photograph, and while he looked at it, she said, You weren't flying on D-Day because on April 24th, 1944, your plane was heavily damaged by a German Focke-Wulf 190. Still, you could have flown back across the English Channel to safety, but you didn't. You knew the B-17 you were escorting wouldn't stand a chance against the quicker German plane, so you doubled back and engaged him, and soon he was on your tail. But just before that wolf blew you out of the sky, you rolled your heavily damaged plane, dropped from the open canopy, and took out the pilot by sending 7 rounds from your .45 through his windshield. Garland started to speak, but Parker kept going. I don't know everything about you, Lieutenant Lennox, but I know you were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart. I know you won enough aerial victories during Big Week alone to qualify as a flying ace twice over, and I know if not for you, there would be 10 more crosses in this cemetery. But you saved every man in that B 17, and they went on to fly on D Day, and then they all went home and lived long, happy lives. Parker handed Garland a stack of photographs and letters and said, I tracked them down. Every crew member from the Savannah Smile. 3 are still alive. The rest of the letters are from their children. Children who grew up knowing that if not for the actions of a man named Garland Lennox, their fathers would not have lived through the war. Parker and I watched Garland read the notes and softly weep, and when he'd finished, Parker said, Garland Lennox, you are the bravest man I know. The old man hugged her, and though I couldn't hear what he said in her ear, he must have thanked her, because after a moment, Parker said, All right, you're welcome. That's enough hugging and crying. Let's get back to that stolen van before we get into trouble. Parker walked between us through the darkening cemetery, holding both our hands, and once we were back in the van, I said to Garland, I can't believe you shot down a plane with a freaking pistol. That's some real Chuck Norris shit. I guess, the old man said in a sudden burst of modesty. Seriously, how are you not famous? Son, it wasn't a big deal, Garland said. Joe Baggio had already cracked the Wolf's windshield for me, and besides, a fella named Baggett did the same thing in the Pacific. Oh, well, if it's happened twice, I guess it isn't that impressive after all, Parker teased. You hush, the old man said to Parker, then to me, and you drive. I'd recorded the entire cemetery scene on my phone, but didn't share the video until much later, because it wouldn't have taken folks long to figure out where we were. But as of this morning, the video has 842,516,985 views, making it the 50th most viewed video in YouTube history, placing First Lieutenant Garland Lennox between Rihanna and a finger-biting British baby, right where he belongs.